Hello and welcome to the Tampering Podcast, part of the Athletic NBA Show Network. I'm Sam Amick, NBA national writer at The Athletic, coming at you for the first time in quite some time. It is fantastic to be back. We have been in off-season mode, admittedly, been in vacation mode, been having a great time. The voice sounds a little bit different today, fighting a little summer bug, but we'll get through it. I'm very happy today. We don't have the normal co-host, Mr. Anthony Slater, Fred Katz, off doing their thing. But I got some guy named Kelly Eco who has been killing it on the Rockets for years, killing it beyond the Rockets of late. And he was nice enough to join me in a pinch this week because I don't know if you NBA fans have heard, but there's a little bit of news going on about a man by the name of James Harden. And Kelly covered James for years with the Rockets, knows his personality, knows his people very, very well. Kelly, my friend, how are you? Thank you for coming on.
Doing blessed. OG, how you doing? Thanks for having me on.
Always good to see you, man. I told you
Yes,
off the
sir.
air, you're looking clean, you're looking fit, happy for you. Things are good. How's the off season treating you?
Doing good. Getting to spend some much needed R&R time, catching up on, sleep, spending quarter time with my lady. Just everything's really good. So
I
getting
like
back
it.
to work, getting back in the swing things. So everything's looking really good.
Love to hear it. So we had planned this pod yesterday, in light of the news over the weekend that James Harden, Sixers star, disgruntled. I'm sure everybody listening knows the story. I'm sure plenty of the folks listening, as indicated by our comments section on the Athletic website, are tired of this story. But listen, it is the biggest news along with the Damian Lillard situation in the offseason. And so over the weekend, for anybody who somehow missed it, ESPN reports that Philly and president of basketball ops, Daryl Morey, had decided to take James Harden off of the table in terms of trade talks, specifically with the Clippers. That's where James wants to be, and that they intended, the Sixers did, to bring James to camp. That story comes out. Naturally, the next question that I pursued was, all right, that's fine, but how does James feel about this? Looked into that, ended up reporting that sure enough, nothing had changed about James's stance, that he had no intention to play for the Sixers ever. And certainly within that, did not have any plans of attending training camp. Now, as you know, Kelly, it's just never that simple. Once we get to camp,
Right.
what does that look like? But the thing that I tried to hit on in my piece that came out on Saturday, and the nuance of it was that it's not really about the hard stance that he's not coming to camp. It's the idea that he still had a belief that more developments were going to happen before camp arrived. Well, little did I know that that it would only take until early Monday morning, stateside, with James Harden on an Adidas tour in China, where, I mean, you talk about, kind of just coming out and screaming it from the mountaintops. He was talking, it seemed, to a group of Adidas interested, kind of fans and kids and mixed company in China. He gets asked about his situation in Philly and says in no uncertain terms that Daryl Morey is a liar and I will never be a part of an organization that he is a part of. And he repeats it twice. That's the framing here. Again, James very, very well. Where was your head at over the weekend when it came to those developments? And then how did this proclamation on Monday morning hit you?
So when the report came out over the weekend, the first thing I thought of was this is not going to end well for Philadelphia, because when you go back to the relationship between Daryl Morey and James Harden over the years, starting out in Houston, it was a fruitful relationship. He got everything he wanted. They enjoyed some pretty successful years together. Coming back in Philadelphia now, there was an understanding that kind of the team around him, it might not have been the most conducive to actually getting to the finals or getting deep in the playoffs. Now, with Daryl trying to take him off of trade talks, James is not going to take that well at all, because he doesn't want to be there anymore. He said that pretty clearly. We saw that this morning. He wants out of that situation entirely. He wants absolutely nothing to do with Daryl Morey or anything he stands for, as you can see. And now, having heard him say that in front of a bunch of his fans and across the world. Also, don't forget the fact that he said it in China. You remember going back to
Yes.
the whole thing with Daryl Morey a few
In
years
Hong
ago.
Kong. And yeah,
It's a political battle right now. So
I honestly hadn't processed that aspect of it. That's
yeah, so
that's
I
that's
think that was a
another layer.
very calculated move by James. But he wants absolutely nothing to do with him anymore, and this is how he's felt for weeks. This is not a new thing. Like he didn't just wake up today and say, to hell with Daryl. This is how he's felt for a while because he feels disrespected and he feels, you know, more or less lied to.
See, that's why it made so much sense to bring you on because you're already contextualized it in a way that is even deeper. James, like you said, I'm sure knew exactly what he was doing
Right.
with his timing, with his location. And the idea, like you said, too, that it's not going to go well for Philly. Let's kind of spin it forward a little bit. We have a blueprint here when it comes to the Sixers as to a similar situation and how it might unfold. So Ben Simmons a couple years ago, obviously didn't want to play for Philly anymore. Felt like he was the fall guy when they fell short in the playoffs. When camp comes around, he didn't want to lose his cash, so he shows up to camp infamously, is kind of hanging out at one of the practices and his cell phone falls out of his pocket. It's just a bad look, kind of half-asses it for a couple of days. And then before you know it, he's out of there again,
Right.
and then they essentially, send him home or he leaves and they figure out the trade stuff, but it takes 6 months. He wasn't getting paid for a lot of that. He ends up getting some of his bread back by way of union, kind of contesting. But like you said, it was messy, very messy. Now we have a James blueprint as well in Houston. It's training
Yeah.
camp time. He doesn't want to be in Houston anymore. I'm going to go party in Atlanta. I'm going to go party in Vegas. I'm going to, barely be out there when we actually compete. I'm going to not connect with my teammates. The John Walls of the world, the DeMarcus Cousins are going to get frustrated. The vibe is terrible. It's bad collectively. And then, to a lesser degree, but similar themes in Brooklyn. When he's done in Brooklyn, I'll never forget. I was in that game in Sacramento. That was his last game with the Nets, where one of those where, you didn't have to be a basketball expert to watch that game and go, boy, he's deciding to tell the Nets he's 100% done. So this is what the Sixers do, is what Daryl Morey has done. This is what James does. These two things do not meet very well. This is a staring contest. How do you think it turns out?
I think in this era, this current era of player empowerment and players essentially planting their flags in the ground, I think eventually the situation is going to reach an untenable point where they just have to trade him. Like if he's not going to report to camp, if he's not, it doesn't sound like he's concerned about the money he might lose, in fines and stuff like that.
What makes you say that?
Just because of how he conducts his business, like how he lives his off court life. He has his wine business. He has other business ventures that are doing pretty well. And it's kind of similar to Ben Simmons, but I'm not sure of Ben Simmons off the court, business ventures where
James
he
has
could.
more revenue streams, I think,
Yeah,
is
he
what
has
you're
more. He
saying.
has he
Yeah.
has more bread coming in. So,
Right.
if it came down to a situation where he had to be fined, I don't think it's something where he would reconsider coming back to Philadelphia. He just wants out of that whole situation. So if it costs him X amount of dollars to get out and get that freedom, I think he'll take that route. Now, on the other hand, I wonder how Daryl plays it. Because as you know Daryl very well, he's also a very calculated individual. He plays chess in his free time. There's a reason why he does that, because every move has to be, right on the money. So this situation, it's going to end up, I think personally, I just think that James is going to eventually find his way out Philadelphia.
Well, and obviously, Daryl's in a spot because James has made it clear that the Clippers is where he wants to be. He wants to
Right.
partner up with Kawhi and Paul George and have another run at a title. To me, the key question on the James side is, what is his fabric when it comes to, standing by the message that he did put out on Monday morning, I think Sunday night in China. And the idea that, all right, you picked up your player option for this season. Now, some of the
Yeah.
fans will say, if you didn't want to be in Philly, you should have just gone to free agency. Obviously, he knew that was a dark road to go down from a financial standpoint. There was not, the Clippers did not have the money to pay him his market by any means. And that's where he wanted to be. And he was hoping that he would go the way, ironically, of Chris Paul back when he went from the Clippers to the Rockets, right? Where it was a pretty clean move where Chris talked to the Clippers, understanding from the Rockets, picks up his player option, gets traded, gets where he wants to go. That didn't happen here. I know this is premature because we have training camp to monitor when it arrives. If a deal doesn't happen by then, we then have the deadline in February, the trade deadline that is the next kind of marker. But the more extreme question, I think, is, does a world exist where James says, you know what, we'll see how much of this season's $35 million I end up getting paid if I don't show up. And if it goes all the way to next summer, is this a guy that with free agency on the horizon and with 33 years of life behind him, would have kind of the fabric to be this stubborn about it and push it out that far?
That's a great question. And as it pertains to the entire length of a season, I don't think we've ever seen that before where a star player or a future Hall of Famer has ever essentially been able to forego a year's worth of salary just to make a point, right? So honestly, honestly think that in this situation, Daryl's going to have to blink first because frankly speaking, if he doesn't get something back for James, this is going to look like a very questionable decision to just put your foot down and continue to be stubborn and not trade him, because at the end of the day, you can get something back for James, even if it means putting the ball more in Tyrese Maxey's hands. And you still have Joel Embiid, you still have Tobias Harris, you still have guys coming back. You have a new coach and Nick Nurse that honestly might be their best offseason acquisition in terms of being able to really structure these guys offensively and put them in a chance to win games, in April and May. So honestly, I just never seen a situation like this before where some player just comes out and blatantly says, this guy's a liar. I'm never going to be in the same room as him again.
Honestly, though, Kelly, like it's very analogous to the Ben Simmons one, but with a major, major, major distinction. James Harden is much more a force of personality than
right.
Ben Simmons is. Ben Simmons is we wondered for months how he truly felt. He
right.
refused endless media requests for interviews. He chose to stay in the shadows. Certainly his people would talk to the media and give you some sense of where he was at. But James Harden is coming out with this kind of force and this kind of candor. And to me, that's what makes it different. Now, like any sensitive and uncomfortable situation like this, leverage matters, right? The one thing, if I was Daryl, that I would feel confident about is that let's ponder the two worst case scenarios for each side. Does this look great for Daryl's reputation? No. We already know that he's been fighting for years this idea that he doesn't view players as humans enough, that he looks at them too much as assets. This is another kind of mark when it comes to that accusation. But absolute worst case scenario, let's say, he doesn't get anything for James. Sixers ownership, which has obviously changed in recent years a bit, is upset. Let's say I don't know the timeline, but it ultimately leads to Daryl's demise in Philly. In the NBA space, Daryl Morey is going to get another job at high money somewhere else. The leverage on his side, I think, is trumping James's, because I think what Daryl is probably counting on is that James deep down does enjoy playing the game of basketball. He knows that Father Time doesn't stop, and the idea of burning a year when your legacy is already it's very good legacy, because you're talking about a former MVP, a 10-time All-Star, but we also know what's always attached to James. Can't win in the big games, hasn't won the whole thing. If you want to find a way to rectify that, you don't have time to be sitting out a year.
And you covered James long enough to know that when you go back maybe the last 8-9 years, he's always said certain things. Like if you feel strongly about a situation, like for example, Kevin McHale, he spoke out about that. He got his way. Chris Paul situation, he spoke out about that. He got his way. The Houston situation, he spoke out. He got his way. Coming back now to Philadelphia, if Daryl's playing the long game in terms of, staying power in the league, Daryl's obviously going to last longer in the NBA than James is, just because of the nature of his job and, how successful he's been. And, like you said, Father Time is catching up to James pretty quickly. So if Daryl, there is a world that Daryl just, because Daryl can go scorch earth as well. Like he's not
right.
James
That's
isn't the
saying.
only person.
Father Time is really friendly to executives. You know what I mean? Like
that's a fact.
You talk about the chess game, and I'm sure Daryl's looked at it from every angle. That's a hell of a piece to play.
So, but let me ask you this, Sam. If you're Daryl and you know that the Clippers are practically the only team that could be a realistic trade partner, do you bite the bullet and just take 50 cents on the dollar, or do you just try and stick it out knowing that you have a guy in Joel Embiid? Because that's another part of the equation. Because Joel's not going to. He's not the happiest camper if James. This whole James Joel is not pleased with this whole situation, frankly
Right.
speaking.
No, and I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, I hit on that before vacation, and honestly learned a bit. This is one of my favorite
Right.
parts of the job is when you report on something and you feel like you hit it close to the mark, but then on the back
Right.
end, once people see that you put certain things out there a certain way, then they'll kind of educate you even more. That did happen on the Joel Embiid story. So he says publicly, and I forget where he was. He was in a was it
Some
a
kind of conference.
he was in a conference, and he alludes to the idea that that he wants to win a championship, whether it's in Philly or somewhere else.
Right.
You talked earlier about James being calculated. These players are smart and they
Yeah.
know how to handle their voice. And the idea was that all right, Joel had made a choice to put that thought out into the ecosystem about the idea that maybe he wouldn't be in Philly. So the Sixers stance and their response at that time was, listen, Joel has talked for years about wanting to stay here for his whole career, to want to go the way of Kobe and Steph Curry and guys like that, Giannis to this point, and be with one franchise, Dirk. Now, that's all well and good, and that's all very true. That has been Joel's mindset. But it was, the part that I did learn about was like, no, it's the last couple of years, there's also been a pretty clear message that, like, if you guys keep effing around, for lack of a better way of putting it, and don't give me the right kind of group, that makes me feel like a title contender, then who knows what happens? Maybe he does ask out. That pressure is there. The Sixers know
Right.
it's there, and Joel this summer had, it seemed, tried to. I mean, he and James are fine, but he had tried to connect with James at some offseason events and essentially convince him to stay, convince him to be good. I think you're hitting on something really important, which is, man, once Joel Embiid saw what James Harden had to say in China, what was his reaction? Because I don't know exactly who Joel, if he's got a list of players that he would love to play with, or if he's
Right.
looking at Daryl just saying, give me whatever the Clippers are willing to give you, and let me work, let me cook. But yeah, the Joel factor is huge here.
And to add to that Joel thing, I've heard, obviously the New York angle is there as well, but
Yep, 100%.
another team is Houston as well. Like, just because of the bond between Joel and Ime, and just that situation where they've added older
This is
veteran
where
players.
super producer Andrew Schleck should splice in some is an oldie but goodie. Alanis Morissette's "Isn't That Ironic?" We need some ironic music right now.
So
Thank you,
so
Schleck.
so I think, maybe in the next year or so, I think, because obviously if Joel stays this season and plays it out, that's the one thing. But moving forward from that, I do think New York and Houston are the two teams to watch if it ever came to a situation where Joel said, I want to leave too. Because look, this whole union of James and Joel, it hasn't been perfect, right? So you go back to how James got there in the first place, and having to essentially pigeonhole his game to just give Joel the ball. That was Philly's game plan for a lot of nights, right? Because he was such a dominant big man, and everything was going his way, winning the MVP. The whole stuff with him and Doc. I remember a story you put out going back to the video with James and Doc speaking, before the season, and how important that was, because that the way that Doc has been able to kind of role play us the wrong way at times, and
Right.
that whole interesting dynamic with that.
If
So
anybody doesn't remember that, it still blows me away, Kelly, that
yeah,
happened. And
I know.
I've tried since then to get clarity on the question of whether or not James knew he was being recorded. So
Right.
NBA TV comes into Sixers camp and had this all access video of Doc talking to James, and really, and I'm paraphrasing, just telling him, like, listen, for us to be at our best, we got to feed the big fella. And then James pushed back a little bit, not in any kind of acrimonious way, but pushed back and said, I just know that, like, if you let me cook, then I'm going to bring the defense, and it's going to make life easier for him. So they were
Right.
having, it was the kind of dialogue that it was so interesting to watch, because it happens on every team, but we just typically don't get to see it. But to your point, my first thought was like, oh boy, like, Doc is pretty calculated in his own right with his voice and his profile in the media. And so
Right.
that might have helped the optics for Doc, because it really looked like he was leading their group. but did James know that he was being recorded? Now, the answer I've gotten was most likely yes. Like James is a bright dude, knows that it was, an all access practice. But you go from that to this, and I think what you're highlighting is the fact that literally for years, it's a Kobe Shaq light type of dynamic
Right.
that they have been
Exactly.
trying to navigate, and it's obviously reached this point.
And then even with the way James, because he took the pay cut, before the year
Oh
to
yeah,
allow them to sign D'Anthony Melton, Daniel House Jr., PJ Tucker. So the understanding was, that on the back end he would get he would get his bread, like he would get some kind of substantial pay
which I
bump
mean, not surprisingly, to interject real quick, the Sixers deny. Which I mean, the league
for sure,
investigated
for
it,
sure.
claimed they didn't find it, but yes, that is clearly James's understanding.
Yeah, so James obviously feels slighted in the fact that he feels like he was essentially lied to, and at the end of the day, the NBA is a business, so you really can't. Everything should be taken with a grain of salt. But if you're James and you took all this less money to try and win a championship, and that doesn't happen, you gotta look out for yourself at the end of the day, right? This is your career, this is your livelihood, this is your family that you're talking about. So I do understand both sides of the equation. I just wish that it hadn't been played out like this in public, because it's gonna get really ugly. Then the league has to get involved, and it's a whole ordeal that didn't have to go this route.
No, I agree. Real quickly, and we're gonna pivot to a couple other league wide things. Any thoughts on the Clippers side of this thing? Because they obviously, Kawhi, Paul are not part of these talks.
Yeah.
This is an everybody else conversation. But when you look at some of the possibilities there for you, and not to put you on the spot, but is there a threshold where you say, so long as this guy, and maybe this pick is in there, let's go. I got to do that, and the Sixers are going to be in a good place competitively going forward. Or what have some of the factors been for you there?
If I'm the Clippers, I'm not sure what's taking them so long. If the sticking point is Terrence Mann or any of these other young players, I don't see why you would have talk stall for this long, because the Clippers as currently constructed, they're on the clock as well. Like, they've had Paul George and Kawhi that have been able to be healthy long enough to give them a realistic run at a championship. And then you have the whole thing of them moving to the new arena and, just the things that come with that. If I'm the Clippers, I'm trying to be as aggressive as possible, even if it means giving up those young players, because at the end of the day, you could make the argument that the Western Conference is wide open. Like, I know Denver just won the championship, off a remarkable run, but you look at the Nuggets, the Suns, the Lakers, they're Memphis, they're some pretty decent teams in the Western Conference. So if you want to give yourselves the best chance at competing, go ahead and get the 10-time All-Star, the future Hall of Famer, even if it means giving up a little bit of young players and future flexibility.
Right, right. Good stuff, sir. Always appreciate you weighing in general, but specifically as a James Harden expert. I think this is something this is going to be a big part of your career, Kelly, all the time.
I appreciate it, man.
We're gonna be coming to you when he's retired. Like, well, how's James? What's he doing? Let's hit on a few other things before we get out in this somewhat brief off-season tampering pod. The stuff that's on my radar, admittedly, as I reemerge into the basketball world a bit after vacation, the Hall of Fame stuff this week was, I didn't catch all of it, but enough to enjoy going down memory lane a little bit. You talk about a hell of a cast with the D Wades and the Dirk Nowitzkis,
Right.
and and seeing all the Spurs guys up there, Tony Parker and Pop, and Becky Hammond, and her speech to Pop was pretty
Wow.
remarkable. I lived through a lot of that stuff, and my mind probably went toward, it was kind of split between the D Wade Heat experience, but the Spurs stuff, they remain, in my opinion, the most underrated group in the history of the game, most likely, and they're not, they're not disrespected, they're not even underrated, is too generalist of a way of saying it, but the longevity of that group and their ability to win titles in so many different eras with a couple different iterations, but with the same culture and with the same leader and Pop doing his thing, was something else to cover. And then even from a media standpoint, who tweeted this? I think it might have been our guy Vinny Goodwill, Yahoo Sports, who said something about how Tony Parker was more forthcoming and kind of candid in his Hall of Fame speech than he had been in his whole career. And it's probably true. That group
Yeah.
media wise, they did not pull the curtain back. They made it tough to cover them. Like I remember one time, Kelly, I was at USA Today. I forget what year. It doesn't really matter. But I'm talking to the Spurs about essentially wanting to do a Tim Duncan appreciation piece.
Right.
Total puff piece, but with good reason. The guy's a legend. And we just hadn't had a lot on Timmy and contextualizing what he'd been able to do. So I'm pushing and pushing, pushing to get a little time with the great Tim Duncan. And essentially the deal we come to is, listen, if you come to San Antonio, I think it was like 5 questions. Like you can get 5 questions. But that's
Wow.
not for the listeners, that's not normally the way it goes. Like
No.
you might negotiate a rough sense of time, 10 minutes, 15, 20, 30, whatever. But it was very specific, 5 questions. And I get there and, I'm coming from the West Coast. So you fly almost a couple thousand miles to get there, get Timmy in the hallway. And I dealt with him a ton, but, Tim just kept the media at an arm's length at all times. And we get in and it's all right, question one. And I'm reading his body language. He's good. He's in a good place. Question two, even better place. Question three, oh, Tim's good. Four, we get to five, and you know me well enough. Like we're rolling. We're 5 questions. And it's not like he's sitting there kind of spitting gems, but he's being open and comfortable. And
Yeah.
I'm sitting there thinking, man, we're going to be good here. Like I came all this way, but we're going to get to 10, 15 questions. And after 5 questions, PR man Tom James, and this is no shade whatsoever. Tom has always done his job well and done it the way he does it. Jumps in, says, all right, Sam, appreciate it. That was 5. And I'm like, you got to be kidding me. And you look at Timmy and you're waiting for the player to kind of say, no, we're good. We're good. But no, that's not how Tim and that group was wired. They would do the
Yeah.
bare minimum media wise while just being legends and absolute all time greats on the court because the basketball was all that mattered to them. In that respect, the Hall of Fame ceremonies, I think, were fantastic because the world will always deserve to learn more and want to know more about this Spurs group that was so special.
And I think celebrating a time in the NBA where there was just less drama in terms of like it wasn't as publicized in terms of you see guys like Dirk, you see the Spurs legends, and they were just able to play basketball. I think for
I
you,
mean, I
especially,
hear you. There's always been,
I
like
mean,
we
yeah,
alluded to Kobe Shaq earlier. Like I
true,
think
that's
there's always
true.
been drama. The media, let's just be real about our industry. The media industry has never been louder than it is right now.
Yeah,
Social media changed everything. 24/7 news cycle changed everything. Yeah, you would have less volume in more ways than one
all right.
because of the ways that the drama got out.
So for you, going back to your illustrious days at USA Today, how was it for you in terms of covering the league when you seeing dynamics like Dirk, staying with one team and Timmy staying with one team? What was that dynamic like? Being able to just kind of get a glance of obviously the Western Conference has always been a bloodbath, but those two teams specifically in that region, how was that for you?
I mean, I loved it. I've been West Coast my whole career, so it was always a kind of a haul to get to Texas. And I did a lot more Spurs in that era than I did Dirk and the Mavs. I did a fair amount of Mavs stuff, but I think part of what you're getting at there, Kelly, is that we did have, and I don't have the data in front of me, but it felt like we had, more all time greats who were cemented in their current location and
Right.
ready to try to compete year after year after year, even through multiple generations. If you look at the Spurs, they obviously were hoping that Kawhi Leonard would feel the same way and help them bridge to yet another era. That didn't happen. But, Dirk and having so much respect for his game, but wondering could he ever get it done? And obviously when he finally beats the Heat in the finals, that was as legendary a run as anybody's ever going to have, not
Right.
only because of what the Heat represented and their star power and their incredible talents, but, kind of the collective toll of Dirk's journey and everything that led up to that, through the Steve Nashes and the Jason Kidds and trying to find his way. I don't have any preference. The stuff with guys moving around is entertaining to cover. But basketball wise, it is like night and day. You see with those Mavs teams when they had continuity with the Spurs teams and even Steph Curry and the Warriors, who I've covered a ton throughout his career. we saw this with the Warriors title 2 years ago, like the value of continuity basketball wise and how it doesn't pay off all the time, but when it does, you can sure see it, and that's the difference between, I know I'm getting off on a tangent here a little bit, but when, Kevin Durant goes to the Suns and I was one of the many people kind of handicapping, like, oh, even though I don't love handicapping super teams to do great things right away, I thought they would be able to figure it out. And they ultimately didn't because when it comes to being on the court and connecting as people and knowing the nuances of one another's game and having the kind of depth that it takes to go all the way, those are key factors. But it was wild to cover those teams because it felt like, I'm stating the obvious here, but they were always there. You know what I mean? Like you just never thought about them being anywhere else. So yeah, again, to see those guys in the same room, and see
Pretty
all the
cool.
affection they
Yeah.
have for one another was really cool. Like there was a video I saw where somebody was taking shots of current NBA players who came in for the Hall of Fame ceremonies and asking them, why are you here? Now, D Wade was the winner in terms of like getting the most guys saying he's there for D Wade, but they would all quickly say, man, I'm here for all of them. Because this was, I mean, let's be real, Kel. Like we have some Hall of Fame seasons when it's like once you get past the first two or three, you're kind
Yeah.
of going, oh, are they in there? Okay. And there's, it's not as star studded as this group was.
This one, yeah. And that just speaks to, the heightened popularity of everything now with social media, like you said earlier, and just people being more aware, even the young guys, people coming up watching the game who weren't able to watch, Dirk and Timmy like live, in action and able to go back and watch highlights and seeing documentaries and YouTube compilations. I think it's really good for the game.
No, I agree. All right, last thing before we jump here, I highly encourage all of our listeners because he's out there busting his butt overseas. Our Joe Varden has been covering Team USA
Yes,
and the
sir.
run up
Joe's been
to the
killing it.
FIBA World. He has been, man, and listen, he always raises his hand for these assignments, and I know that sounds like a funny way of putting it because it's got to be nice to travel like that on the job. But listen, this is a time when most of us are shutting it down. Joe is
Yeah.
killing it on that beat. He had a piece today that cracked me up. I even thought about sending a text maybe to Steve Kerr and to Joe saying, man, Joe's trying to start a little riot with these players because he's writing about how the Team USA crew in the past under Greg Popovich would always have these amazing breaking bread dinners with lots of wine flowing and Joe keeps reporting on the behind the scenes stuff and how, these little updates, colorful updates on how, well, still no dinners like Pop used
Yep.
to do. Like, dang, Joe, you trying to tick off the current team,
The
but they're
good old
having
days.
fun. Yeah. They had a magician come out. Apparently, he's getting into all the stuff about how this team is trying to come together
Yeah.
as they try to go get the gold. So make sure you read Joe. As always, make sure you read Kelly Eco on the Rockets and elsewhere. Kelly, my guy, I appreciate you. Fantastic seeing you. Thank you for coming on today, brother.